There is a curious phenomenon happening in the world right now. Something quiet, almost imperceptible for those living only on the surface of everyday life, yet deeply noticeable for those who have begun to observe reality more carefully. More and more people report the same sensation, as if a kind of veil were becoming thinner, as if old ideas, inherited beliefs, and social patterns that seemed solid for decades were beginning to reveal cracks. And when this process begins, something inevitable happens in the human mind. Questions appear that rarely surfaced before. Who am I beyond the roles I play in society? Why do certain coincidences seem to occur exactly when we need them most? Is there any relationship between the way we think, feel, and the events that begin to unfold in our lives? These questions are not new. Philosophers, mystics, and scientists have reflected on them for centuries. But something unique is happening now. For the first time in history, millions of people are investigating these questions simultaneously. Some call this a spiritual awakening. Others prefer the term expansion of consciousness. In modern psychology, it is sometimes described as a shift in cognitive paradigms. And in certain fields of physics and philosophy of mind, scholars are debating the very nature of reality and perception. It is important to be clear from the beginning. When we mention quantum physics, we are referring to a rigorous scientific field that studies the behavior of the fundamental particles of matter. Quantum physics itself does not claim that the mind creates reality. In the simplified way it is often presented online. However, some philosophical interpretations inspired by these discoveries have opened space for a fascinating question. To what extent does consciousness participate in the experience we call reality? Neuroscience, for example, has demonstrated something remarkable. The human brain does not simply record the external world like a camera. It constantly interprets, filters, and reconstructs information. In other words, what we perceive as reality is largely an experience processed inside the mind. This means two people can live in the same environment on the same day and still experience completely different realities. And when we begin to understand this, something profound changes in how we look at life. Because if perception actively participates in the experience of reality, then developing awareness of our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs becomes more than a philosophical exercise, it becomes a practical tool for transformation. Perhaps that is why so many people feel called to investigate their own minds, emotional patterns, and the deeper meaning of existence. If reflections like these have crossed your mind at any point, consider subscribing to this channel and supporting this video. Small actions like these help expand the reach of conversations that encourage reflection, self-knowledge, and conscious living. Every person who begins to think more consciously contributes, in some way, to elevating the collective awareness of humanity. Now imagine a simple metaphor. For a long time, humanity lived as if inside a vast room illuminated only by a few dim lights. Those lights represented our traditional explanations of reality, culture, education, social systems, inherited beliefs. They offered some illumination, but they also left many areas of the room in shadow. Over the last few centuries, science began installing new lights in that room. Discoveries about the universe, the human brain, energy, and the nature of matter expanded our field of vision. At the same time, ancient spiritual traditions, contemplative philosophies, and practices of self-inquiry began to be revisited with new eyes. And suddenly something interesting happened. People began to realize that perhaps science and spirituality are not natural enemies, as we were often led to believe. Perhaps they are simply two different languages trying to describe the same fundamental mystery, the nature of consciousness and reality. This meeting between science and spirituality is not simple. Interpretations are not always correct. Sometimes exaggerations or oversimplifications appear and must be examined carefully. yet a profound movement is underway. More researchers are studying consciousness, perception, mental states, and their effects on the brain and human behavior. At the same time, millions of people are rediscovering practices such as meditation, contemplation, and inner investigation. The result is a new form of dialogue about reality. One that does not reject science, but also does not ignore the subjective dimension of human experience. And this is where something truly fascinating begins to emerge. Perhaps the transformation of human consciousness is not happening as a dramatic revolution visible in the streets. Perhaps it is happening in a much quieter way, inside the mind of every individual who begins to question, observe, and investigate their own experience of being alive. And when a mind awakens to itself, a chain of transformations begins. Transformations in how we think. Transformations in how we feel. Transformations in how we act in the world. And when many minds go through this process at the same time, something extraordinary becomes possible, a collective shift in how humanity understands itself and the universe. But before we go further, an essential question remains. If something is truly changing in human consciousness, what are the signs of it? And perhaps even more important, how can you recognize whether you are part of this transformation? That is exactly what we will begin exploring next. When we begin to observe the cultural and psychological transformations of the past decades, something interesting appears. It is not a single isolated event or one specific theory. It is a collection of signals emerging across different fields of knowledge and human experience. One of these signals is the global rise in interest in self-awareness practices. Research data in psychology and mental health shows a significant increase in the search for meditation, mindfulness, integrative therapies, and contemplative practices. Universities such as Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford have been studying the effects of meditation on the human brain for years, using functional MRI to observe changes in neural activity. These studies reveal something very concrete. When a person regularly practices states of conscious attention, such as meditation or contemplation, certain brain areas related to emotional regulation, empathy, and self-awareness become more active and better integrated. In simple terms, this means the mind can be trained to operate with greater clarity and stability. This is not an abstract spiritual concept. It is an observable neurobiological phenomenon. At the same time, contemporary psychology has begun to explore something that for a long time belonged mostly to philosophy: the subjective experience of consciousness. An interesting example is the research on metacognition, the mind's ability to observe its own thoughts. When a person develops this ability, they are no longer completely dominated by automatic thinking. Instead, a space of observation emerges. And within that space, something transformative happens. The person realizes they are not obligated to believe every thought that appears in their mind. It may sound simple, but in practice it can radically change the experience of life. Think for a moment about how many human decisions are guided by automatic thoughts that have never been questioned. I'm not capable. Things always go wrong for me. The world is hostile. When these thoughts are treated as absolute truths, they shape behavior, emotions, and choices. But when awareness begins to observe them, something interesting happens. They start to lose their power. This is one of the earliest signs of expanding consciousness. It does not mean someone becomes permanently calm or enlightened. It simply means they begin to recognize the inner mechanisms that previously operated on autopilot. And that recognition creates a form of freedom that did not exist before. Now, another fascinating phenomenon is emerging in our cultural landscape. More and more people report experiences of synchronicity. The term was popularized by psychologist Carl Jung to describe meaningful coincidences that seem personally significant even when there is no clear causal explanation. It is important to remain careful here. From a scientific perspective, coincidences can occur simply through statistical probability. Our brains are also naturally inclined to search for patterns and meaning. However, what makes synchronicity experiences fascinating is not merely the coincidence itself, but the psychological impact they create. Many people describe these moments as small windows that awaken a deeper curiosity about reality. Perhaps you have experienced something similar, thinking intensely about someone and receiving a message from them minutes later, finding exactly the book, phrase, or idea you needed to hear at a specific moment in life, or noticing that certain opportunities appear shortly after important internal shifts. Science does not claim these events are direct manifestations of some universal mystical field. That interpretation belongs to philosophical or spiritual perspectives. But what we do know is that when the mind becomes more conscious and attentive, it begins to notice connections and possibilities that previously went unseen. And that completely changes how someone experiences the world. Reality no longer feels like a cold and random mechanism. Instead, it begins to appear as a deeply interconnected system in which our internal choices influence the paths we walk. Now allow me to share something important with you at this point in the journey. In a space like this, where we are exploring consciousness, perception, and inner transformation, the words we choose are not merely information. They are also intention. There is a simple exercise that many traditions of self-development have used for centuries: conscious affirmations. Perhaps you have heard about them before, but rarely does someone explain why they may have real impact. From a psychological perspective, when we consciously repeat a phrase that represents a new belief or direction, we create a process known as cognitive priming. In other words, we train the brain to recognize and strengthen certain thought patterns. Beyond the scientific explanation, many spiritual traditions also recognize a symbolic and energetic dimension to spoken intention. When you express a clear intention through words, spoken or written, you organize your mind and attention around that direction. And attention is one of the most powerful forces of consciousness. So I invite you to try a small experiment now. If it resonates with you, write in the comments or in your personal notebook the following phrase: I consciously choose the frequency that creates my world. It may seem like a simple sentence, but there is a deeper reason behind this invitation. The affirmations you record here, in the comments or in your personal notebook, are more than words. They are vibration codes. When you write, read, and consciously repeat them, you create an energetic circuit that reprograms the mind and anchors this new timeline in your field. That is why when I invite you to comment, it is not just to engage the video, it is to nourish the collective flow of consciousness. It is an anchoring exercise. Daily repetition transforms vibration into identity. So if you wish to seal this understanding now, write here or for yourself: I consciously choose the frequency that creates my world. Repeat this phrase in the coming days, out loud or silently. Let it become the soundtrack of your vibrational field. Because each time you pronounce it, the universe reorganizes its particles around this new coherence. And gradually, everything that does not resonate with it begins to dissolve, naturally, without force. Practices like this may seem simple, yet many profound transformations begin exactly this way, with small changes in how we relate to our own thoughts. And as this awareness develops, a new stage begins to emerge. People do not merely observe their thoughts. They start questioning the entire belief systems that shape their lives. And this is precisely where one of the most significant transformations in human consciousness begins to unfold. As human consciousness becomes more reflective, an interesting psychological phenomenon begins to emerge more clearly: the crisis of meaning. For much of modern history, life followed a relatively predictable script. Study, work, build stability, form a family, seek social recognition. This model brought progress, organization, and security to many societies. But in recent decades, something has started to shift inside the minds of many people. Even when individuals achieve what society defines as success, career, financial stability, recognition, a subtle feeling sometimes appears. A quiet question begins echoing in the background of awareness. Is this all there is? This question does not arise because life has lost value. In fact, it often appears precisely because consciousness has expanded enough to sense that human existence may have deeper dimensions than simply fulfilling social expectations. Contemporary psychologists call this the search for existential meaning. Philosophers have discussed it for centuries. And ancient spiritual traditions have long suggested that at some point in life, human beings feel the impulse to investigate the nature of their own consciousness. In simple terms, there comes a moment when a person stops asking only, "What should I do with my life?" and begins asking something more fundamental. Who is the one living this life? This shift in questioning may seem subtle, but it radically changes the direction of inner exploration. When someone begins to observe the mind more deeply, something surprising becomes visible. Many thoughts that feel deeply personal were actually learned. Ideas about success, ideas about failure, ideas about what is possible or impossible. Many of these beliefs were absorbed in childhood and reinforced throughout life by culture, education, and personal experiences. This does not mean these beliefs are false, but it does mean many of them were never consciously examined. And here we reach an important insight from psychology. The human brain largely operates through predictive patterns. It builds mental models of the world and then interprets new experiences based on those models. This is extremely useful for survival. But it also means that often we are not simply seeing reality. We are seeing our expectations projected onto it. When a deeply rooted belief says, "This is not possible for me," the brain tends to filter information that confirms that narrative. But when a new belief begins to emerge, the perceptual system also changes. That is why awareness practices, such as mindfulness, reflection, or meditation, can generate such profound shifts in life experience. They create space between the observer and the automatic patterns of the mind. Within that space, new choices become possible. And this may be one of the most fascinating aspects of the awakening of human consciousness. It is not about rejecting science or denying objective reality. Quite the opposite. It is about recognizing that the way we interpret reality deeply influences the life we experience. This understanding is not only spiritual. It also appears in psychological fields such as expectancy theory, the placebo effect, and studies on growth mindset. All these areas point toward a similar idea. The human mind actively participates in the experience of reality. This does not mean magical thinking instantly controls the universe. That is an oversimplification often found in popular interpretations. But it does mean something far more interesting and powerful. Our mental states influence decisions, perceptions, relationships, and actions, and those factors profoundly shape the paths we walk. When someone begins to understand this practically, life stops feeling like a random sequence of events. Instead, it begins to appear as a process of conscious co-creation between internal choices and external circumstances. And here is a second simple but powerful exercise. If the first mantra was about consciously choosing the frequency that creates our world, we can now deepen that inner decision. If you wish to participate in this experiment of awareness, write or repeat to yourself, "My consciousness is awakening to new possibilities." Repeat it slowly for a few moments. Not as a mechanical phrase, but as a declaration of mental openness. Because the expansion of consciousness often does not happen when we try to control everything. It happens when we become available to see beyond old limits. Now imagine the collective impact of this. Millions of people around the world beginning to question limiting beliefs, learning to observe their own thoughts, developing greater empathy, presence, and emotional awareness. This kind of transformation rarely appears immediately in headlines, but over time, it changes entire cultures. Deep transformations in humanity almost always begin the same way, quietly, inside the minds of individuals who choose to look at reality with greater clarity. And when we look at the signs of our time, the rising interest in consciousness, mental health, and spirituality integrated with science, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that something meaningful is indeed unfolding. Perhaps we are witnessing the first steps of a humanity beginning to understand something essential. Evolution does not happen only in the body or in technology. It also happens in consciousness. When we look at the history of humanity from a broader perspective, we notice that the greatest transformations rarely begin in dramatic ways. They do not necessarily appear as sudden events that change everything overnight. Most of the time, the deepest changes begin quietly. They begin inside the minds of individuals who start seeing the world differently. People who question old assumptions, observe their own thinking, and realize that reality may be more complex and more interconnected than it first appears. This movement is not new. Throughout history, philosophers, scientists, and mystics have suggested that human consciousness is still evolving. Modern science is still far from fully understanding what consciousness actually is. It remains one of the greatest mysteries explored today by neuroscientists, physicists, and philosophers of mind. Yet even without definitive answers, we already know something important. The way we think deeply influences how we perceive the world. The way we perceive the world influences our decisions. And our decisions, over time, shape the reality we experience. This means that becoming aware of our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs is not merely a philosophical exercise. It is a practical ability that allows us to live with greater clarity. When someone begins to observe their mind more carefully, something interesting happens. Automatic reactions start to be questioned. Old beliefs begin to be revisited. And gradually a new way of relating to life emerges. More presence. More responsibility for one's own choices. More openness to learn, change, and grow. If millions of individuals undergo this type of transformation at the same time, the results inevitably begin to appear in society. Cultures evolve. Values shift. New forms of cooperation and understanding emerge. Perhaps this is exactly what we are beginning to witness, the early signs of a humanity learning to look at itself with greater awareness. And this brings us to a simple but powerful question. If the evolution of human consciousness is truly underway, what role does each of us play in that process? The answer may be simpler than it seems. It begins with attention. With the willingness to observe our thoughts without immediately believing all of them. With the courage to question beliefs that limit our potential for growth. And with the daily practice of aligning our actions with higher values, such as clarity, compassion, responsibility, and awareness. If it resonates with you, return to the two mantras we explored along this journey. I consciously choose the frequency that creates my world. My consciousness is awakening to new possibilities. Repeat these phrases in the coming days as reminders of an inner decision, not as magical formulas, but as mental directions that help organize your attention and actions. Because every collective transformation begins the same way, with individual choices that may seem small, yet over time reshape how we live, think, and relate to the world. If this reflection brought you any insight, consider leaving a comment sharing your perspective. Conversations like these create a collective field of reflection that can reach others who are also searching to understand reality more deeply. Liking and sharing this video also helps these ideas travel further, encouraging a broader dialogue about consciousness, science, and human transformation. If this message resonated with you, share it. Help expand this field of consciousness, because each person who awakens illuminates hundreds of others. Leave your comment, your vibration, your testimony, not just for engagement, but because your energy is part of this collective construction. And remember, the highest timeline is not a place in the future. It is a state of being available here and now. May you walk in peace, in clarity, and in love. Until the next awakening.